In this podcast, I'd like to talk a little bit about the purpose of your assessment tasks, and in this one particularly focus on assessment task 1. To locate the details about assessment task 1, just to remind you that you can go to the assessment task section of the website and then click on the folder link here. As discussed in the welcome podcast that I presented to you all, this course, a key part of this course is the 5 days that you'll spend in schools, in classrooms. Whilst you're in schools, we expect you to perform 2 broad sets of activities. First of all, the thing that you're probably all looking forward to the most is to undertake a range of small teaching tasks. So you might work with individual students or small students whilst they're working on their lesson activities, supporting them, asking them questions, helping them. You might take some other teaching tasks like taking the roll in the morning or leading a show and tell activity or a class discussion or reading a story. You'll do all sorts of other things with your mentor. You become like the mentor's shadow. But there'll be another podcast about that a little bit later. But a critical component of what we want you to do on this initial round or initial placement in schools is to become what we call a participant observer. That means that whilst you are being an active part of the classroom, you're also wearing another hat. And that is that we want you to undertake a number of formal and informal observations or audits in the classroom. We want you to do this because it's really easy to miss what is really happening in a classroom. Classrooms are incredibly complex spaces. There is a lot happening simultaneously. They're also rather familiar places to us. Most of you will have spent at least 7 years in a primary school classroom, so they become very familiar. It's very easy in familiar settings to not see what's really happening. It's very easy in familiar settings like a primary school classroom to assume that we know what's going on because we've lived in them. But you haven't been in that classroom as a teacher, or at least the majority of you haven't. So this is the first time we want you to see through teachers' eyes the complexity of the classroom. The other thing is that the majority of your mentor teachers, those teachers who will be supervising you, are fairly accomplished teachers. And they make everything look very, very simple. And from a cursory observation, you may well not notice the work that's gone in and is going into what's happening inside the classroom. So for that reason, we want you to step back from the classroom, put a different set of lenses on and try and make what is very familiar unfamiliar. We call it making the familiar strange. So what does this participant observation look like? Well, let me first start by distinguishing between what an observation plan is and what an audit tool is. And why we don't mind which you use, and you can use a combination of both. An audit tool generally requires you to observe the classroom or a lesson and record instances of something that we've asked you to look at. For example, this is an example here of an audit tool that you might use. What we're asking you to do is to draw a map of the classroom. Show the tables, so you might draw the tables like this. You might have the teacher's desk out here. Teacher, for example. You'd be using a proper pen and paper, not an iPad tablet where your handwriting would be far more legible. So you might have a student there, a student there, a student there, and a student there. One here, one here, one here, one here. And then what you might do is place an asterisk against those people who answer, not ask, answer a question. So there might be an asterisk there. There might be an asterisk there. There might be 3 asterisks there, as this student's answered 3 questions. Then you might place in a different colour a question mark with an X next to it against this particular student who's asked a closed question. In a different colour again, you might put a question mark with an O next to it to indicate that this student has asked an open question. You might have a question mark with an O or a number of question marks with O's against the teacher. This then becomes a record of the number of instances of who is asking and who is answering questions in the classroom. Then you analyse that. What's it telling you? But again, this is an example of an audit where you're recording the number of times each person has asked a question or answered a particular type of question. Asked a particular type of question or answered a question. So an audit tool. An observation plan, by comparison, is usually less quantitative and more qualitative. For example, over a day you might be interested in observing rather than counting how your teacher might begin a lesson or how they might draw each lesson to a conclusion. So rather than sitting there recording instances of something happening, you might be actively involved in supporting students, in working with students individually, but during that beginning of every lesson across the day, you might take a mental note of what strategies your teacher has used, and at recess or at an appropriate time when you're not required by the students, you might take a physical note of that. Let's have a look at an example. So here's an example of an observation plan. This is quite a detailed one, but it's around how a lesson might be organised, helping you to unpack what the structure of a lesson might be. So you might be recording notes in these sections here, rather than tallying up or counting quantitatively what's going on in the classroom. They might be more descriptive entries and comments that guide your observation. They might be things that you are able to do as they're happening, but they might also be your recount of what you observed later at a more appropriate time, but as close as possible to the lesson so that you don't forget or that your memory doesn't start to play tricks about what particularly happened. So that explains the difference between an observation plan, it tends to be a qualitative tool that you design, and an audit tool or an instrument, which tends to be more quantitative. So, now to what we want you to actually do. Assessment Task 1 is in two parts. The first part is for you to design your own set of observation tools. On the website, in the Assessment Task 1 folder, we've given you some examples. Some of these are not particularly good, some of them are okay. We want you to design your own. We want you to design 2 audit tools or observation plans that could be implemented by you or by any other teacher in any classroom. Focus both of those tools or plans on a single topic. We prefer that you stick with this list, but if you have an idea for something else that you want to examine in the classroom, discuss that with Rohan and get his permission first. So the idea is that we want you to design those particular tools, 2 classroom tools, either audits or observation plans or one of each. Before you start the design process though, it's really important that you understand the theories about learning and teaching that relate to your particular topic. If, for example, you are looking at questioning, then you would be looking at key resources and theories about questioning that will inform the design of your particular audit tools. This is really crucial because what you're being asked to do is to draw on the theory and resources to provide a rationale for your particular design. So the steps to success in this particular assessment task is to 1, do lots of reading, or quite a bit of reading, about your particular topic, so you know what good practice is meant to look like from what the theory says. Secondly, design your audit tools or your observation plans. What sort of things do you need to be paying attention to when you carry out that audit or that observation? They're the sorts of things that we need to see present in the instruments that you design. The third thing that you do then is provide that rationale, that explanation, drawing on theory, as to why you have designed your observation plan or your audit tool in the way that you have. What does the theory say you should be looking for if you're looking at questioning in the classroom, for example? So what we want you to hand in are the 2 observation audits or the 2 instruments that you have designed as appendices to the rationale. So start with the first paragraph, very briefly explaining what your focus is and what your tools are designed to do. And then move into why you've chosen the sorts of features that you have chosen. And that's Assessment Task 1, Part A. In Assessment Task 1, Part B, whilst you are on placement in schools, on one of the 5 days, take one of the instruments that you designed and implement it. Try it out in a real classroom. So use it in one of the days that you're in schools. Then what we want you to do is to reflect on what you found and reflect on the tool itself. So there's 2 parts to this reflection. Describe briefly what you observed and what the context was. Analyse the findings. What did they tell you? If you think back to the who asks the questions and who answers the questions audit tool, what is that telling you about the sorts of questions that are most commonly asked? Do the students ask more open questions or closed questions? Does the teacher ask more open questions or closed questions? Is one student answering all the questions and dominating the class discussion? Are the students not even asking any questions? So analyse the findings. Make some links back to your beliefs and preconceptions about teaching and learning. Is there anything in what you've seen that rubs up against your way of thinking, that challenges what you think and believe or affirms what you believe? Link back to the relevant literature, she says, stumbling over her words. Ground your observation in theory. Then, in the second part, examine the tool itself. What were the strengths and weaknesses of the audit tool that you designed? What suggested improvements would you make to your own tool? The majority of your effort should be focused on this section here, analysing and linking back to your own beliefs and preconceptions about teaching and learning. So for those of you who with a science or a maths background, this is the challenging part. We want to know what you believe, so you should be writing in the first person, linking it to relevant literature. I hope that clarifies what we're looking for. Before we close, make sure as a habit at university that you read through the criteria. They're also located in the Assessment Task 1 folder. Read through the criteria. That's how we'll be marking you, and that will help guide you. Good luck.